I've called my talk Working with the Emotional Pain of Children Through Caring Relationships. And I'd like to talk a bit about the work of the Mulberry Bush School in Oxfordshire. The school is based about 12 miles from here, in the village of Stanlake. And since 1948, or even before 1948, on that site, we've been working with very highly troubled children. And these are children who have suffered what we call early years trauma. Children who in the earliest weeks and months of life have experienced trauma and neglect and abuse, which has led to them being unable to form normal, healthy relationships. So our job is to find ways of helping them re-engage in relationships. And our aim through residential care is to reintegrate children back into their family, an appropriate family, and an appropriate school in their community area. Can I just ask how many people in the audience might have heard of the Mulberry Bush School? So probably about, not far from half, that's great, that's good. And anyone had any direct experience of the school, yourself?
Many.
In management? Can I ask when that was?
Indeed.
Okay. As a trustee manager, yes.
I was a health visitor in Whitney, and Stanley was my village, so I went to visit it. And I got to know.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sure. Can you hear me at the back? Is that okay still? The microphone working? Okay, I think I'd like just to start with an illustration of a bit of theory about the background to the emotional pain of children. So I'm going to draw on the flip chart. Can you see the flip chart? Can people see the flip chart?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just bring it over here a minute. And there. I'll move it out again in a minute. I think when we understand the normal emotional development of a child, we think of the baby being nurtured by the mother from hour one, day one. And in terms of the theory of emotional development, Donald Winnicott talked about the theory of the parent-infant relationship. And this was also developed by John Bowlby through attachment theory, and by Donald Winnicott when he said there's no such thing as a baby. And when he said that there's no such thing as a baby, he meant where you'll find a baby, you'll also find a mother. So this presupposes some basic facts. One is that generally we have a mother and we have a baby. And this is the dyadic relationship. And we know that when this goes well, the baby starts to evolve in an appropriate way. The baby can feed, the baby can start to relate to the mother, the baby starts to develop gurgling sounds, feels soothed by the mother. And we talk about if you like, the projection and transmission of communication. So the baby, in this instance, will cry, the mother will hear the cry, and the mother will respond intuitively, thinking to herself, my baby's crying. Does the baby need a feed? Is the baby tired? And she'll respond by either feeding the baby or putting it down in a cot. And she receives the communication and responds in an appropriate way. And when the response is appropriate, the baby feels soothed, or the baby feels that its needs have been met. And this process, this interaction, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, of the first 3 years of life, we would argue, set the scene for the foundations of good experience. Where you and I came from, we have enough wherewithal, enough of a good experience of that bonding with our parents, mothers, carers, to feel that we can carry on in life. Does that make sense to people? Are you with me on that? You don't have to agree, by the way. Please feel free to argue. So I'm really talking about, in terms of the school, the failure of this very first experience of an attachment with a significant other, or mother in our case. And of course, if you take half the equation away, if the baby starts to cry, this is the cry going out, this is the communication, and the communication isn't received, the baby continues to cry and there's no response. And the baby might continue to cry and there's no response. At some point, the baby, who can't think like an adult, can't think, where's mum? Mum's not here, starts to assume, or intuitively, or at some very primitive, instinctual level, starts to realise that the environment is not responding. And in this environmental failure, if this continues, the baby begins to expect neglect, expect that there's no one there to receive the call, to receive the cry, and no one there to respond. And this terrifying situation is what Donald Winnicott calls unthinkable anxiety. When there is no response to the baby's cry, when nothing comes to the baby, there's no solace, no concern, no response. And in our belief in the school, the children who come to the Mulberry Bush have experienced something akin to this. There is no attachment, no early bond to help them make sense of the world, of themselves and others as well. And using the theory, Winnicott and other psychoanalysts went on to say that in the absence of that responsive relationship, in the absence of a caring, containing, holding environment, the baby starts to develop defences with the expectation that no one is there for me. By the time the child is 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 or 7, they become self-reliant. They're not looking to be fed or be looked after. They're looking to meet their own needs, maybe through stealing food, through survival. So these conditions whereby children, very often in the care system, start off on a trajectory which is about instinctual survival, self-gratification, which will lead, without any intervention or any treatment or help, into a trajectory into violence, crime, sexual abuse, prison, or the psychiatric services. So this is the critical issue. The Mulberry Bush School offers an early intervention for children who have suffered very early trauma, where there's been no parental response to meet their need. Does that make sense to you? Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to now dip a bit into the history of the school and then talk a bit about our cultural ethos. And within this, I don't want to forget about working with the emotional pain. The series at St. Giles is thinking about working with pain and suffering. And I would argue that any child who starts the world without a responsive mother, without regular feeds, without a normalising situation where they can expect a regular feed, to be comforted, to be warm, to be clothed, that is a situation which is hopeless and helpless. And our human response is to somehow find a way to help the child make sense of that and give the child the nurture and love and care that he or she needs. So going back now to the school itself. Is this a pen I can use here? This is the Mulberry Bush School in Stanley. My story starts right back during World War II. Let me move this as well so you can see. And during World War II, as part of the national evacuation campaign, many children were removed from the London boroughs as a result of the Luftwaffe blitz in London. And many children were taken to the safety of the rural countryside. And Oxfordshire was no exception. On the front field here, around about here, back in the 1940s, 50s, there was a very large rambling farmhouse. And in this house lived a lady called Barbara Docker Drysdale and her 4 children. And her husband, Stephen Docker Drysdale, was away on active war service. So during World War II, a number of children were billeted with the Docker Drysdales in their farmhouse in Stanley. We lost a picture there. Nice. Okay. And anyway, Barbara Docker Drysdale realised that some of the children now living with her really found it quite difficult to make relationships, or they found it difficult to communicate, or they would steal food or damage furniture. And she started to try and make sense of this phenomena. Was this a result of being taken away from London, from family, or was this something more deep-seated, something more in their pathology? In the post-war period, in the late 1940s, she first met up with Dr. Donald Winnicott, who was working at the Paddington Green Hospital in London. And Winnicott himself was starting to formulate ideas about the earliest forms of deprivation, how children were affected by the absence of parents and mothers. And round about the same time, John Bowlby was also starting to work on the concept of deprivation, and they didn't call it attachment. What happens when there isn't consistent caring, parenting for young children? And on a monthly consultation basis, Barbara Docker Drysdale and Winnicott started to formulate a concept which they later called the provision of primary experience. And their thesis was that if you have a specialist environment, you can give back to the child something they've missed out on. And that something is reliable routines, relationships, and a structured way of living and learning that will help the child re-engage with the possibility of an attachment, of a good foundation in life, and the possibility of growing back to some sort of normal emotional development. So by 1948, the government, in the post-war reconstruction period, was looking for places to home and house and educate the thousands and thousands of children who have been dislocated and disconnected from their families and the major cities through the wartime and the Blitz. And in 1948, they offered Barbara Docker Drysdale and then the Mulberry Bush School status. And the Department for Education at the time were looking for something of a cross between a special needs school that could manage the behaviours of the children and a child guidance clinic where the children could be given therapeutic forms of relationships which would help them grow emotionally. And this is exactly what Dr. Drysdale offered the children who were with her from London, a cross between a residential school and something more therapeutic, an environment in which children could explore and test out relationships, and in fact test out the environment as well. By 1969, the large rambling farmhouse here was literally falling to pieces, becoming very dilapidated, very decrepit, and the Gulbenkian Foundation generously offered Barbara Docker Drysdale £90,000 to build a brand new school. So in 1969, the old farmhouse was demolished, and a new school, a typical 1969-70s flat-roofed quadrangle school was built on the site, with dormitories upstairs and classrooms downstairs. And that square there is what remains today of the 1970s school. Across the 60s, 70s and 80s, the school maintained a high-quality reputation for working with the most troubled children. And in fact, Dr. Drysdale wrote several books about the experience. In 1968, she wrote Therapy in Childcare, which became quite a major bestseller in the social work world. In 1970, she wrote Consultation in Childcare, which is about her experiences of consulting to childcare teams and working with psychodynamic principles in childcare. And then in 1990, 7 years before she died, she published her final book, which was called The Provision of Primary Experience, going back to that original concept, that Winnicottian concept of developing an environment that can meet the needs and provide the right conditions in which very deprived, very disturbed children can grow. Today, the school is, after a major fundraising project in the 1990s, we have built 4 households, so 1, 2, 3, 4 households here. So the children live in dedicated living groups with a staff team. They attend the school. These buildings now converted to school use. And we also have built on classrooms here. And we've modified the whole campus so that really it is a bit like a children's village. We call it a therapeutic community. And the key principles behind a therapeutic community are that, first of all, the child's relationship or attachment needs are met on a one-to-one basis. The children can explore and make deep relationships with adults, significant adults, in the residential care or school section. We have a school which provides national curriculum education, and we also have what we call a therapies and networks team, which comprises of 5 therapists, 2 which are therapists, 1 music therapist, 1 drama therapist, a speech and language therapist, and a school nurse, and 3 family support workers. And increasingly, over the last 10, 12 years, our aim has to be, as well as to work with the child placed at the school by local authorities, to increasingly work with the parents and carers who live with the child for the 14 weeks of the year when the child isn't with us. So we have a 38-week provision, term time boarding, then children go home, back to foster families, adoptive families, some birth families and some children's homes, where they re-engage in a more mainstream life. And our aim is, after 3 years, the child will be fully integrated back into an appropriate family and an appropriate school. I've given you a lot of information there, so are there any questions? Am I being clear about some sort of overview of the task and the history of the school? Anything anyone would like to ask, feel free to ask a question. Oh, you got my name? Yeah.
What's the age group that you take them in?
Good question. Yes, the age group we work with are children referred technically between the age of 5 and 13. However, we very, very rarely get a 5-year-old referred. We've currently got about 4 6-year-olds, and we generally don't take children above the age of 10. And that's because we found that the optimum time for a placement at the school is about 3 years. And that 3 years is significant. The first year allows the child to be imbued in the culture and ethos of the school, get to know people, feel nurtured and contained, a bit like literally holding the baby in arms. The second year is more of a consolidation of relationship building and learning to be in a classroom, starting to learn with the teacher and starting to learn with peers. And the third year, third year, is a time when we're having to start to think with the child about where the next placement will be. So there's clear organisational reasons for 3 years, but I think if you look more unconsciously, more dip below the surface, in fact the first 3 years of any child's life are significant. And I think what we try and do is offer a very primary regressed experience in the first year, a slightly more weaning experience in the second, and the third year is helping the child to move on from the school and reintegrate into a family. So in fact what you have is something akin to the first 3 years of a child's life anyway. So organisationally it's structured as a therapeutic intensive course. In terms of the child's experience, it probably feels a bit like a chance to start again. So that's how I explain it to people. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. Any questions? Sorry.
When children move on, what contexts and family situations do they move on to from the school?
Very good question. I'll put a bit of background first and then answer that. About 3 or 4 years ago, about 50% of our children came from birth families, usually with single mums, and the single mum herself had often had drug or alcohol problems or been in the care system themselves. So these were families with a very low economic bracket, and very often a mother or parents with quite severe mental health problems. The other 50% were generally from children who had been fostered. What's happened over the last 5 years, government policy and local authority policy has generally been to look to fostering as the preferred model for looked after children. Now, there's a basic assumption there, isn't it, that the family is the best place for children. And for many children, the family is absolutely the right place. But if you go back to my diagram before, if you've never had a coherent sense of self, if you've never learned to live with parents or understand what a parent does to you, then your behaviours can be so extreme that you will test that family into destruction. So what we're finding now is that about 53% of the children who are coming to us have broken down 3 to 5 foster placements. So these are children who are put into a foster family in the hope that they will bed down and become a normalised child. But their behaviours are either so aggressive or so sexualised or so chaotic that the family simply hasn't been able to cope with the extreme behaviours. And then another family's been tried, another family, and by the end of 3 or 5 families, the local authorities thinking you must find an environment which can contain, hold, and work with this child as the family hasn't. And in terms of the theme of loss and pain, that's a terrible, terrible place for a child to feel that I am so toxic, no family can have me, love me, I am unlovable, and therefore I will continue meting out my strong feelings about the injustice of the world. And similarly for the families who offered, want to offer a stable, loving environment, they then feel that that's been undermined as well. So at every level, we're working with terribly strong feelings, people's helplessness and hopelessness, both within the children themselves and in the professional systems. And I'll talk a bit more about managing strong feelings from the children and how we support staff to work with the emotional pain, and given the fact that many kids have been severely sexually or physically abused as well, and this stuff is still raw in them as well. Okay, so does that answer your question more or less? Thank you. Yes, go back. And so our aim after 3 years is to reintegrate the child back into the family they came from, whether that's the foster family or birth family. Sometimes, while the child is placed at the school, the foster carers or adoptive family or even the birth family gives notice saying, I don't want the child back. In which case, we look to find another foster family to start slow stepping stones over the placement period, and by the time the child leaves, we hope they are more emotionally equipped to be able to live in the family without testing its destruction. So it's a continuous process of helping the child grow, looking towards other placements, or working with the family and the local authority to make sure the fit on the turn is as good as it can be. Maybe that.
Listening to the list of therapists that you have looking after the children,
yes.
I imagine that this all costs an enormous amount of money, and I wonder how you justify it to those who would see it as a waste of money on children who are not worthwhile.
Absolutely. A poignant and powerful question. Residential care is expensive. The Mulberry Bush is one of the few charities left working in the residential care sector for children. Most residential provision now is privatised and profit-making. There's ourselves in Oxfordshire, there's Glebe House, which is a Quaker establishment over in Cambridge, and there's Childhood First, which is a residential community based in Northampton and Cambridgeshire as well. We argue that the fee to place a child at the school, which is expensive, covers the running costs. And the local authorities buy into that. And 3 key components of that service are the residential care 38 weeks of the year, where we feed, clothe and look after the child 24/7. That requires adults to be with them 24 hours a day, to sleep in overnight. We have a specialised school on site with 4 levels of education, with intensive staffing, no more than 8 children, with 1 teacher and 2 teaching assistants, and then, as you mentioned as well, a therapy and family support team. And my argument always is to local authorities that if we don't pay the fee now as an early intervention when the child is 6 or 7 for 3 years, you can guarantee if that child does not have an intervention which helps them make sense of the world, allows them to form relationships, then the trajectory will be that that child will become increasingly marginalised across adolescence and into their 20s and 30s. And we also know that the unintegrated child, the child who starts off with extreme deprivation, will become the prolific offender in the future. You only have to go to a prison system and you'll find that something like, I think, 37% of prisoners have been in the care system themselves. They've had no early intervention, which has allowed them to integrate and internalise a different way of living, a way of being alongside people. So that's our argument in a nutshell. We also, as a charity, we fundraise. The added value of living at the Mulberry Bush School is that we pay a lot of attention to the actual physical environment. So to ensure that the homes the children live in are well equipped, well furnished, we fundraise constantly. The fee the local authority pays for does not cover any, it just covers running costs, it covers nothing more than running costs. So we also fundraise for fabrics, furnishings, furniture for the children, and we also fundraise to ensure that the children can go on holidays as well and on a regular basis. So we think as a charity, we're very attentive to the real cost for the taxpayer, but I think we're also very, very focused on good outcomes. And in response to your question and the lady before is, what we know is that the prognosis for these children is very poor, but 93% of our children who are unable to be in a family when they arrived are able to be in a family when they leave the school after 3 years. So 93%, 100% of children who are unable to be in a school on referral are able to be in an appropriate school on leaving. That means there's damage limitation for 7% of children who will need ongoing specialist treatment, who might need another residential school. And this is a reflection of the severity of the deprivation and trauma we're working with as well. That's the reality. These are the most damaged children in an open environment. Okay, shall I move on from there? Was there one other question I didn't answer? Yeah.
I was just going to ask about the process that they go through and how you balance curriculum needs with therapy and how individualised it is.
Yes, a very good question. The answer is that every child who comes to Mulberry Bush School is part of what we call a treatment team, and the treatment team is formed by the child's key worker, the child's household manager, the child's teacher, the child's therapist, and the child's family support worker. And these people work as a multidisciplinary wrap-around the child, a team that really thinks about the work that the child's engaging with, both in the household and relationship building, the social emotional curriculum, the educational curriculum. A lot of our children have quite severe blocks to emotional learning, so the first year, the foundation class is akin to a nurture group. The idea is to be together, to learn to be together in a group, and learn through play, through creative arts, and because we only have 8 children in the classroom and 1 teacher and 2 teaching assistants, we start basic skills learning on a one-to-one basis within the context of a group. So each child has an individual treatment plan, which incorporates their educational and social emotional needs, and weekly, monthly, the team meets up to track progress, record progress, and then this progress is taken to the child's looked after review or the child's education review, at which the local professionals come to as well. So we really track and think carefully about the child's both their social emotional development and their educational development. Some children do very well, some children are slow learners, and I think we try, in the same way as a young child grows, the social emotional foundation, if you don't get that right, you don't learn. So our focus in the school is on the therapeutic intent at every level, in the classroom and in the household. The primary model is building attachments, learn to be with people, learn to live in a group, and from that the educational attainment grows in small, significant steps. Okay, I'm going to read you a brief case study of a child, that's here, and to try and sort of pull these scenes together. This is a child called Lucy, who was referred to the school some years ago. And I pulled it into this with quite a short case study, which will give you, I hope, some idea of the culture and ethos, and really the impact of working with intense deprivation and abuse. Okay. I've called it Lucy's story, and this is an anonymised case study, but a true one. At the age of 3, Lucy was taken to care by social services. She had been discovered living in a house which was being used as a base for trading in drugs and sexual relations. As a result of living in this environment, Lucy had experienced severe emotional neglect as well as physical and sexual abuse. Lucy's behaviour had become so disturbed that she was found to be eating off the floor with several dogs which were also inhabiting the house. Prior to admission to Mulberry Bush School, Lucy was placed with foster parents. In week 1 of the foster home, her behaviour included wetting, smearing, self-harming, aggression, insomnia, inappropriate affection to strangers, extreme controlling behaviour and cruelty to animals. Her insomnia resulted in one or other of her foster parents having to stay awake all night with her. Attempts at schooling failed as her behaviours were so aggressive and uncontrollable. She was also therefore severely underachieving. As an early intervention to help her make sense of her chaotic life, Lucy started play therapy sessions with the local child and adolescent mental health service team as a CAMS team. Her therapist described her as being in complete turmoil. In sessions, she was described as being highly aroused, tense, and exhibiting signs of physical and sexual abuse she'd experienced. She showed no understanding of keeping herself safe. Her therapist commented, "She brings chaos and destruction into everything she does." Lucy was referred to the Mulberry Bush School at the age of 7 and was placed in one of our 4 care and treatment households, living in a group with other children of primary age. A dedicated staff team lived alongside the children, creating a reliable daily routine. The structure of this routine included close supervision and support through all aspects of the day: meal times, playtimes, bedtimes, transitions to school, etc. The staff managed and resolved the frequent behavioural breakdowns, arguments, rivalries, and the general antisocial behaviour of the group of children. With time, Lucy responded to this re-education in relationships and started to understand that she could be helped to engage with normal and respectful social living. Through this daily routine, the care staff gave Lucy opportunities to help her think and talk about her confused, betrayed and angry feelings. She started to find alternative ways of interacting and little by little started to come to terms with the injustices in her life. In the education area, Lucy joined our foundation stage, where she was helped to enjoy learning again. Alongside an introduction to the national curriculum, the children are encouraged to play with preschool equipment, listen to stories, sing, dress up and work, and play cooperatively. After a year, Lucy moved to the 2nd tier class, where expectations of behaviour, application and learning are higher. She was still a noisy child, readily distracted and easily led into others' misbehaviour, but she made good progress and was able to move to the top class a year before she left the school. During this last year, she successfully made a half-day visit to a local mainstream primary school, supported by staff from the Mulberry Bush School. And during this treatment process at the school, periods at home with her foster parents were still difficult, with Lucy exhibiting her previous testing and challenging behaviours. However, the school placement offered some respite for her exhausted foster carers, who were all able to recharge their batteries during term time. With time, the foster carers also noticed an improvement in her behaviour. Lucy was becoming more articulate about her needs and started to display more loving and affectionate feelings. The carers began to look forward to a time when she could come and live with them full-time. After 3 years, Lucy was able to make this transition and return home to her foster parents. She is currently doing well and the placement remains stable. She is successfully placed at a local school for children with moderate learning difficulties, and despite being quite demanding, she is no longer unfosterable nor unacceptably disruptive in school or other social situations. So you'll see the outcome there wasn't the perfect child, the cured child. It was a child who was able to re-engage with a foster family, where the behavioural drive and onslaught had reduced, and she was able to attend a local school for children with moderate learning difficulties. So she was able to get back into a family and get back into the community. She might never get 5 A levels, she might never be a brain surgeon, but it's enough. She's got enough to form positive relationships and move on into the future. Okay, let me just get back onto the... I'm just going to move down one, I think. I'm not sure that one. Okay, so just a bit more about the type of children you see. you folks, I'll read this out as well. In terms of referrals to school, the children come with generally a diagnosis of, severe emotional behavioural difficulties. If we break that down a bit and look at the actual underpinning and underlying issues, what we know is that 100% of our children have conduct disorders. This means they are driven to test the environment of the structure, in Winnicott's words. Their behaviours are challenging, we call them social emotional difficulties. 96% of our children have attachment disorders. And as I explained before, when the attachment goes well, and when the bond goes well, the child has a foundation of good experience from which to grow and learn. For children where the attachment has been severed, there are different forms of attachment disorder, from the disorganised, where the child has internalised chaotic parenting, maybe the fact that the parents lived in an atmosphere of domestic violence, no structure and routine to the day, and these are the children who adapt to that environment by going into survival mode, terribly mistrustful and testing the environment out. 62% of our children on arrival have difficulties reading, 65% have difficulties writing, and 58% have difficulties of maths. So these are children where really we're having to offer a provision that helps them start again through basic relationships and, as your lady at the back said, through engaging with some very basic learning in the educational area. I'll show you a few pictures, give an idea of the environment. This is a typical bedroom of a child, one of the 4 households. When the children arrive at the school, we try to take away the trappings they come with in terms of material goods. Some will arrive, talking with their iPad and trying to sort of bring loads and loads of toys. What we offer the child is a basic environment which is populated by caring adults, where there are regular meals on the tables, where there is a bed, good furniture, and a daily structure and routine. And a typical routine of the day is the children will be woken up at between 7:30 and 8 in the morning. They'll then be alongside adults getting dressed and ready. They'll come downstairs to have breakfast at about 8:30. Before the education day starts, all the children and adults in the house will meet together in the living room and have a meeting to discuss the day, what's happening in the day, are there any visitors to the school, are the children going on trips out, what's the plan for the day. They're then they're escorted over to the education area, and there's a handover between the care staff and the teacher, so the teacher will know of any difficulties the night before, early in the morning. And then the children are in the classroom alongside the teacher, 2 teaching assistants and a behavioural support team, engaging with the day-to-day, the curriculum issues. Around about 12:15, the care staff will come back over to the classroom, collect the children. There'll be another handover to find out which children have had a relatively good morning, whether there's been difficulties. There's a lunch break between 12:15 and 1:30, where they'll have wholesome lunch with the adults around a table. They'll be encouraged to talk about the morning. There'll be a playtime, and then they'll head back to school about 1:30. Between 1:30 and 3:30, they're back in the school for more formal lessons. And then collected at 3:30 by the care staff. They go back over to the house, and generally at 3:30 there's another meeting to bring the children together to discuss the events of the day, hear about their learning, hear about what parts of the day have been good or have been any difficulties. And from there on, the evening is planned, and there'll be a structured tea time, probably around 5 o'clock, 5:30, a playtime, and then really from 7 o'clock or 7:30, they're going into a bedtime routine. Now, many of the children, because do find transitions terribly difficult, there's some transitions into the classroom day or back to the household. Very often the adults will take them in hand, they'll talk them through the transition. And the transition into the night time is difficult too. A lot of children have nighttime fears and anxieties, and so settling time, the adults will be alongside the children, stories will be read, there'll be warm drinks, cocoa, hot chocolate, some food as well. So we really try to be attuned to the child's needs and get into the child's mind around the anxieties they have in relation to routines and structures. As well as the sort of day-to-day routines, we do have whole school experiences. We try and celebrate the whole community through things like sports days, through camping trips, through open days. And this is just a picture from a sports day 2 years ago where the staff and children are seen running in a race together. And I think the important thing about these sort of cultural community experiences as well, they help children realise that, children who have been so egocentric and in such in survival mode that, I'm not the only person in this place that has troubles. So if a child breaks down and is managed, children will start to recognise that their troubles and struggles are shared by others too. And through the learn to live cooperatively and through shared experiences, they start to realise that they can become part of a team of the blue. They can learn to live in a family environment. They can be part of a classroom, and they can become part of a community. So really, the therapy community offers the basic attachment, one-to-one relationship building. It offers experiences of stability and making sense of living in a group, whether that's a family group or a class group, which can be transferred on leaving, and the experience of living in a community where you have to think about others and you start to pay attention to other people's needs as well. A few more photographs here. We also run as part of the Education Week what we call Forest Schools. Some of you might have heard of Forest Schools, which is an outdoor curriculum where children are encouraged with their Forest School curriculum leaders to go out into. We've got some woods a few miles away, we've got a small wood on site as well. Engage with sort of fire making, safe fire making, cooking, carving, making swings, doing woodwork as well. And the children really love that as well. And I think that engagement again in safe activities which allow the children some sense of risk, tree climbing, where we will assess the risk but they're alongside adults, and a chance for those children to burn off some of the slightly manic energy or their energy through planned excitement and planned activities is really, really important. And that takes me on to, I think, there are two traditions sort of meeting at the moment. One is the psychodynamic, psychoanalytic one, whereby we think about the inner world of the child. Also, the neuroscientific agenda is big in the minds of professionals these days. And I think for troubled children, the psychodynamic model offers a focus on relationships, thinking about the child's inner world, symbolic communication with the child, getting alongside the child and working through some of the trauma. The neuroscientific agenda tends to focus more of a scientific model whereby we're thinking about the child's inability to self-regulate. And I think it's through experiences, planned experiences like forest schools, where we're giving children a chance to burn off energy, to take a bit of risk within the confines of the adult supervision, that children can learn to regulate in a healthy way. And this concept of literally a baby in arms is being rocked and soothed by the mother as well. And we've also introduced play materials into the school, so swings and times when children can go out and be rocked in swings. And we've got like basket swings as well. So we're also trying to think about the sublimation of the physical adrenaline, cortisol-driven aspects of a child who is troubled and distressed, alongside the more relationship-based ones, thinking about the child's inner world, and bringing these two together subtly and appropriately. And I think our attention to both the formal educational modelling and something about getting the children outdoors and playing, being alongside people, also plays in this idea of forming relationships in the broader, wider environment too. So you might be in touch about some of this stuff, and it's something I think is increasingly influencing high-quality therapeutic work. 60-year tradition post-war of psychodynamic theory, and how neuroscience and particularly the work of Bruce Perry and Bessel van der Kolk has started to influence how we think about the child's evolving developing brain. I think what's really positive in terms of that message is that what we're hearing is that despite trauma, despite learning trauma which freezes the regulation, freezes the child through the impact of cortisol and adrenaline, through a caring environment where relationships have a primacy, neural pathways can start to link up, and the child's brain is plastic, and we can start to recreate the appropriate pathways in which children can start to learn and re-engage with more positive relationships. So it's a positive message, a complex message, and our aim is to try and integrate these two disciplines, these two complementary disciplines, into a lived experience for children who are referred to us. I'll show you a few more pictures and then I'll talk a bit more about managing despair in the child and in the staff teams as well. This is a typical meal time. You can see we try and provide in the households nice wooden furniture. We're looking towards a homely atmosphere. We're looking to a social experience of a meal time where staff and children sit down together. They're encouraged to help serve each other. Our children have quite severe problems with food, probably as a lack of early feeding, the inability to have a good experience of feeding. Some are very faddy, some will withdraw from food. So a lot of energy goes into building nurturing relationships and enabling children to be able to sit down and eat a meal socially as you would in the family. And of course what we're doing here is building on the idea that when the child does leave and is hopefully reintegrated back into a family, they will have the ability to be part of a social family group and live in a more normalised way. That's a little picture there of a typical child in the classroom. This is one of our teaching assistants alongside the child, engaging in some one-to-one work. And as I said, the balance always is between helping the child develop basic skills in literacy and numeracy, alongside helping them be part of a group and then to live in the group in the classroom situation. And again, what's really important here, that is transferable back into the school when they leave the school. Any questions just for any of these pictures? Maybe that way, no, we'll talk a bit more about support structures.
I'm just really fascinated in the connection between, you know, talking about self-regulation and neural pathways and childhood trauma attachment disorder. Also, similarities with things like ADHD, even autistic type behaviour, sensory processing disorder. I'm wondering how much you see children who come in with emotional behavioural disorders that are also looking like they've got ADHD, autism, and how much actually those things resolve themselves, or just the relationship between the two.
No, absolutely. It's a really good question, and we also, I mean, just in terms of sensory, I haven't mentioned sensory difficulties at all. We also have an occupational therapist who comes in who's really hot on helping the child develop a broader ability, or, you know, a broader sensory awareness through a variety of different ways of being as well. It's a good question. 10, 15 years ago, all the children who came to us would have probably a diagnosis of an attachment disorder plus ADHD attached to their name. In the last 5, 6, 7 years, as well as the children being referred simply because they're uncontainable in the home setting or school setting, ASD is the new diagnosis. Now, clearly, we're not geared up for working with children with severe autism. And autism is a spectrum from high-functioning Asperger's type to extreme autism where the child needs a literally one-to-one. What we're finding is that a number of our children have what we now call complex needs, broader complex needs. Their base experience is probably attachment disorder. They probably have been neglected or suffered a very early trauma. But when autism is almost defined by an inability to make relationships, to see the other and make a relationship. However, so is severe trauma. So when you're disassociated, you also might not be able to look in the eyes of the person you're alongside and form a relationship. You might cower away from that, expecting that that person will abuse you or be physically violent to you. I think what we're finding, and trying to make sense through a variety of assessments, through both psychotherapy assessments, using our speech and language therapists and using our occupational therapists, is trying to differentiate, has this child got an autistic aspect to his or her personality, or is this trauma? Is this the disassociation formed by trauma? And I think what we're understanding is we've probably got a couple of kids who are slightly high-functioning autism, But we also know that the environment we've created is a talking, fast-thinking, fast-moving environment. And a fully autistic child would just feel completely lost in that environment. So although I think probably out of the 22 kids we have at the moment, there might be one or two who might have slightly autistic features, they're not so debilitated that they can't make sense of relationships or talk. And I think where that becomes apparent is they're very concrete in the way very, very concrete, very, very black and white in the way they engage with adults and children. And we'll make allowances for that. But I think if we had a child who was more on the autistic spectrum, we would know simply this child cannot make sense of a complex but lively lived experience in the day-to-day. And we're doing a lot of work around that. And we're very conscious that almost every child now has ASD as a diagnosis. And we're having to think very carefully is where does the ASD end and the social emotional behavioural difficulty attachment disorder begin? And we're getting pretty good at that, I think, as well. So it's very difficult work, very difficult work. And I think increasingly, to be slightly cynical, probably in this increasingly marketised world, with health coming on board to social care and education as well, there's something about, unless you have a diagnosis, there'll be no money. So I think we're going down a marketised route where the need for diagnosis is part of the referral process to get children to places like the bush. And I worry about that, and I think we have to respond thoughtfully and both understand the real need and not get caught up in the diagnosis too much as well. Thanks.
I was, do you have a waiting list? And was the provision like another